All right, well, welcome. Good morning, and welcome to folks online. The live stream's off and running. It's good to have you here on another lovely day. Margaret and I were talking about days like this. It's hard to draw a crowd for evil when people sin last week, evil this week. Easy to draw a crowd for evil in other senses, but in terms of talking about it, that's our topic today. So there's name tags at the table, which helps build community if you're willing to put a name tag on. And let's see, Margaret's got to run out early. If you don't know, she's being installed today as associate pastor. Yay! If you've never seen an installation, they're always joyful services in their own right. And I have to run out then around 10:15 because I'm supposed to process in, and I've got some role that requires me to wear a different coat. So just to be forewarned. So today's topic is interesting. It's evil. At least that's what we decided to call it. We had short titles for all of these. And this comes from these questions that we've been walking through, and they're on the tables if you don't recall them or if you want a copy, which are these baptismal affirmation questions. Different traditions have different ones of those, which are these basic confessions of faith, and we're following that as kind of a template to figure out how to talk about our theology and what does it mean to embrace one's theology and to understand the implications of that theology for others and for the world. And so we're talking about evil not because it's the topic we chose necessarily, but it's because there it is in that baptismal question. Second part of what we started talking about last week: do you turn from the ways of sin and renounce evil and its power in the world? Where does that come from? Might be a good way to start this. You might remember, I think it was in week 1, 2, where Margaret had a bunch of baptismal questions. I think it was week 1, right? And a lot of them talk about renouncing the devil or renouncing Satan in some traditions, which is in some ways the more traditional language. I always think of the concluding scene in The Godfather, the film, and Michael's answering the questions for his godson as they're taking care of business in the wider world, right? This idea of denounce Satan and all of his works, I believe, is that traditional question. My hunch is that more recently that was changed to evil, not as a way of saying nobody believes that the devil exists, but as a way of saying that's not necessarily an article of faith, right? However we understand evil, its sources, its nature, let's not make that the defining issue, but let's talk about evil in a more abstract way, perhaps. I think a good aspect of that development is to say, belief in the devil or some kind of personal evil force that you can't see. It's probably good that we don't insist on that as an article of faith. The negative part of this is if we kind of leave evil undefined in some ways by this question. What are we talking about? I would note, too, that the question isn't necessarily about defining evil. It's about evil and its power in the world. And so the question seems to be more about what are the ways in which evil affects human existence? How does it deform human existence? How does it set people against God? Is this the opposite of God? Is the power of God in the world? Is the opposite of the power of God in the world the power of evil in the world? Or is opposite the wrong word to use? There's a whole bunch of questions, I think, embedded within that. But we'll do our best in just one session to try to get to the bottom of this, of what we're talking about. So, as a way of breaking the ice, what are some things? Notice I didn't say people, although you're welcome to say people if you want. Preferably none in the room or none that would cause a too big of a political fight to break out. But what are some things you think of as evil? And it's really hard. I used to like to use images in my PowerPoint. It's very difficult when you're teaching on evil to find PowerPoint images that are appropriate. So I just put this. I think evil are the folks who blow my neighbor's leaves way too early in the morning on a weekend. Maybe they're themselves not evil, but the leaf blower could very well be evil. But that's more of a joke. But I can just take notes up here. But what are some things you think of? How does that term evil get used in our culture in ways that are helpful or maybe not so helpful? And we can I'm going to even try this instead of the board today. Which is I can just take notes on here. So what do you go ahead and shout them out. I'll repeat them for folks online. What are some things you think of when you hear that word evil or what gets, yeah?
Bombing innocent children.
not editing out the innocent part, just so I don't have to type as much, but okay, some kind of an atrocity that just seems so far gone, right? Torture. Did I hear that? Two people at once? Is that what? Usury? That's a good word, right? Exorbitant interest, right? The credit card offers that come in, only 30% interest or something like that, right? We talk about payday lending a lot in this culture. At least that's been a more frequent topic, or bail bonds, right? A particular kind of lending that might be targeted to a particular population, for example. Bigotry. Oops. See, this is the problem. Slavery. Hmm. Hatred against God. Murder. Ooh, that was last week, his list of sins, too. That's interesting. Okay. Hateful speech. Child abuse, sexual abuse. Yeah. Greed. Folks just coming in, we're talking about evil. Plenty of seats up front. There's also some chairs in the back. If you need help unstacking them, we can get help. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Margaret. Fentanyl? You're just trying to make me spell it, aren't you? Is that it? Okay. Environmental destruction. We're never going to let me do this again. Why is that breaking like that? Anyway. Good Lord. All right. Arrogance. Hubris. Terrorism. Did I hear racism also? Is that? Yeah. Domination. Right. Any other thoughts? When sometimes we're talking about big categories of malice, right, or things that have a long tail of consequences and effects, or that get embedded in the society. Power? Oh, poverty. War. Exploitation. All right. I mean, look at these. Think about some of these. Are some of these fit in the category, so to speak, of evil because they're just the magnitude is so much? Are they sins turned up with the volume? Do they seem something else to you? Are they a different kind of way of talking about badness, right, or malfeasance? Or I don't know the answer. I mean, it's not like this is not a guess what I'm thinking kind of a question. Okay. Yeah, the comment was a lot of these get to exploiting others for one's own benefit, maybe using people as a means to an end or something, or to a means for one's own either gratification or power or wealth. So. Okay. Yeah, the comment was some of these can be communal sins or can become maybe ingrained in a community. Is that fair? Whether it's a family, a congregation, neighborhood, nation, right? Destructiveness. Yeah. Some of these things are hard to erase or fix. You know what I mean? There's no simple fix to a lot of these types of sins, which is different from, if I hit your car, I can get the dent pounded out, for example. Let's keep going and keep thinking about some of the complexity of what we mean when we talk about evil. Most of these that came up were moral evils. Philosophers like to sometimes will split the difference between two kinds of way of talking about evil. Moral evil being the things that human beings do, the result of a choice uh, to somebody else, while natural evil, like what we saw with Hurricane Ian, for example, that causes untold suffering, but isn't necessarily an individual's fault. Now, the problem, of course, is sometimes it's hard to split these things too neatly and evenly, right? You remember the tsunami, we're now well over 10 years ago, right? Um, which which wiped out so many lives in Southeast Asia, partly because people suffering from poverty tended in those places to live in weak homes that were closer to the water, for example. So there are ways in which human choices can kind of combine with a quote unquote natural evil and also do great damage. A wildfire that wipes out a neighborhood is, in some ways, we look at it differently if it's started by lightning versus if it's started by somebody, like an arsonist, for example, right? That there are ways in which these things aren't too neatly divided. In some ways, that distinction is helpful. It's a reminder that maybe not all evil, or at least not all human suffering, can be traced back to sin or to malicious deeds. There are some theologians who would think otherwise, who would say we wouldn't even have earthquakes if, it weren't for Adam and Eve. You might have heard that kind of speaking, that kind of language, right? That somehow the universe suffers in some way because it's humanity's fault. We're certainly discovering in recent years, right, the power we have over things like the environment and over the weather. At least I think we do, in ways that perhaps weren't imaginable to our ancestors whose writings we have in the Bible. But nevertheless, it's important, I think, to think about ways in which we there's an aspect of suffering that appears to be kind of written into the fabric of the universe, right? I mean, there's the unfairness of life and the way that that pain and death and suffering come about. I don't think we always want to affix necessarily blame to all of that. I also, as we keep going, I just want to be clear with a couple of things as we get deeper into the conversation. First is I have no comprehensive answer when we're talking about evil. And if you thought that I would, I'm kind of worried, and we should probably chat a bit sometime in this week about why you think that. I think my way of thinking about evil as a theological category is largely to remain open and to kind of be content with not having really too many solid answers. I'm content to leave a lot of this unresolved. And I think that's partly because I worry about the church or Christians being too quick to label certain things or certain people as evil. Right? It can be easy to do that. I think at times the scriptures have a way of showing communities of faith labeling outsiders as evil or as reprobate or too far gone to be saved. There's a lot of kind of insider outsider language in the Bible that focuses around evil, and I think maybe because I spend a lot of time there in the Bible, I do worry about being too quick to saying that I have the power, even we have as a community have the power to decide who or what is evil and who or what is not. At the same time, that doesn't mean we don't speak about it or don't care about it. I just have kind of chosen to leave a lot unresolved when we talk about evil and to make jokes about it. Like, I don't understand why you get hot dog buns 8 to a package and hot dogs neither 6 or 10 to a package. That strikes me as, if not evil, at least one of these things I'll never be able to understand and drives me crazy when I go shopping. When we think theologically, I want to say there's room for many, many, many perspectives as we talk about this. So be aware of that. I'll probably say something that'll make you say, I thought he would have believed differently, or I think that, and he seemed to dismiss that, right? There's a room for a lot of this, partially because the question is so unsolvable and has been asked as far back as we can look, not just in the Bible, but in other human cultures as well, right? What's the nature of evil? Nevertheless, our ways of approaching the topic, our ways of talking about evil, I think have consequences for how we think theologically, for how we treat our neighbors, for how we understand the world in which we live, right? In other words, the definitions we give to evil are going to have influences on how we think. Just like last week, I talked about how you think about sin is going to influence how you understand who God is, what God wants from us, how God helps us, what it means to be saved or to be redeemed by God, blessed by God. So all of these things have connections that we'll keep coming back to, I think, especially in the next 2 weeks when we talk about Jesus and what difference does Jesus make. When we reflect on topics like these, big theological topics that I think nobody has developed an entirely satisfactory answer for, how should we reflect on these? I would suggest always remembering what's come to be known as the Wesleyan quadrilateral, which is a terrible name. And John Wesley never used the name, so don't blame Wesley for it. A Wesley scholar in the 20th century kind of made up that name, the Wesleyan quadrilateral. But in looking at John Wesley's own theological reflections, he said Wesley tended to look at four things. And those were Scripture, tradition. In some ways, those come really close together. I mean, Scripture is in many ways traditions handed on from the past. But here, tradition, he means history of the church, right? How has the church typically answered theological questions? What have we learned from mistakes the church has made in its history? What are some things we've learned from success stories in the church's history? Experience, right? How do we experience God? How do we experience the world? What do dissenters have to say, people who disagree about these things? Have people had religious experiences with God? And how do we talk about that? In this case, have people had experiences with evil? And how do we talk about that? Certainly today we'll do a bit with Scripture. That's kind of where I reside. We'll talk a bit about tradition as well. I'm not going to talk so much about experience, but I just want to make sure we acknowledge this is a big thing for a lot of us in how we talk about evil. I think back in my own history of reflecting on the topic. You remember Scott Peck's book, People of the Lie of a Certain Generation? Scott Peck wrote The Road Less Traveled, which was probably sold a gazillion copies. He has another book called People of the Lie, which are his reflections as a psychotherapist on evil. Don't read it at night when you're alone. Just chilling stories about clients I had and other people he knew. It felt like there was no human soul there, or where like a capacity for empathy was totally gone, right? And so to read that, I think is really interesting. I had a long conversation once with somebody who had a career in the FBI working with on profiling and catching serial killers, which was also, I'm really glad it was a lunch conversation and not like a late night conversation at a camp somewhere. But it came about because I had been teaching on the Gospels. We'd been talking about demon possession and exorcism stories. And she just wanted to lay out in some ways some of the people that she had been in contact with. Similar things, people with absolutely no remorse for horrific crimes and horrible stories of things done to them in their childhood, and just saying, is there a point where somebody ceases to be human, right? In the sense of a conscience or a soul. I mean, just chilling stories, right? People I know who are credible people who have awful stories to tell about encounters with just no other word for it, but wickedness, right? Stories we know as well of atrocities where the sum appears to be more than the parts, right? Anybody who studies the Holocaust, for example, or the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, right? Like something seems to have happened in certain events that's just more than a couple of powerful people making bad decisions. So what does that mean? So sociologists can help us here with this. So I just want to note that this is not just a question of what does the Bible say and then we're done, but I think experience means a lot for this. And then the fourth part of Wesley's kind of system is reason. And so here I would put things like scientific developments, psychological developments. What do we know about the human psyche? What do we know about criminal behavior? What do we know about the damages to people and what people are now calling things like soul repair, right? How do you help a wounded soul? Reason is probably also helpful for how we survey the mistakes the church might have made in the past, right? And being too quick to call certain people, certain things evil. Does that make sense? This is just kind of for your own thinking, right? And you ask, what's the right balance with these four? It depends on the question. It depends on the person, I think. So just to keep that in mind, right? Because of time and because of my own expertise, we're going to spend most of our time in Scripture and tradition, but there's a lot more we could do. We could all sit around and tell stories about our sense of how we've been influenced by evil or just bad in the world, that would be an interesting morning, actually, wouldn't it? Um, so let's finally get to work then. So when we're talking about evil, what are we talking about here, and what does that question lead us toward, and what, as people of faith, might we think are the important questions to ask? I think when we're talking about evil, there's at least 5 different possibilities. There's probably 50, but I'm just going to talk about 5 different things. First, are we talking about a question of origins? Is this a question of like, where does human capacity for evil come from? Right? Do we need to know about this? Do we need to care about this? Obviously, in the Bible, there's an interest in this. Genesis chapter 3, the so-called story of the fall, about what takes place in Eden. You probably know some of the basics, right? With the serpent who tempts Eve to eat the forbidden fruit. Never says it's an apple in the Bible, by the way. That's a little Bible nerd trivia for you. Eats this forbidden fruit from the tree of different, yeah, the knowledge of good and evil. There's 2 trees. There's the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the serpent says, because Eve says, we're commanded not to eat of that fruit because then we would be like God, knowing the difference between good and evil. And the serpent, who interestingly enough is never named as Satan or the devil in Genesis or in the Old Testament, later Christian tradition in some ways kind of made the serpent as a personification of evil. The serpent just seems to be this wily, kind of mischievous creature. So we get that story in Genesis chapter 3, a story that's also done quite a bit of damage in terms of blaming women, for example, for the fall. Right? This idea of Eve was tempted and then she tricked Adam. And that's, if you don't know that story, that's also got a long tail throughout Christian history. In the New Testament, Romans chapter 5, the Apostle Paul spends a little bit of time talking about how sin entered into the world through Adam and Eve, and death followed with it. It's part of Paul's kind of mythic understanding. When the Bible talks about these origins, it's myth, and I use that word myth in the most generous possible way, saying we're trying to talk about things and we're trying to assign a story to them, try to explain these aspects of what does it mean to be human, right? Or what is this human existence all about? Where does it take us? I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure the question about origins is really worth fighting about. There are some Christians who want to insist that Eden was a real place and you have to believe this story. I'm not sure it's the right way to read this text. Maybe it's a way of shielding God from charges that God is the one responsible for evil. Maybe it's an attempt to, put evil squarely on the shoulders of humanity. We can talk about that, but this is one of the questions people ask when they talk about evil. Another question is, are we just talking about immorality and its degrees, right? Do you ever cross a line where you're so sinful you're just done, right? The Grinch gets really close, but of course is redeemed at the end of the story. Like I said, it's hard to find good clip art when you're talking about evil. Right, when we talk about evil, do we just mean like sin on steroids? Right? Do we, like we talked about earlier, do we just mean systemic sin or sin that has consequences that can't easily be repaired? Right? Is there a line out there where my ordinary sinfulness somehow crosses and becomes evil? Like, just what do we mean by that? And so there are some people who approach the question of evil as just kind of magnified sinfulness. I tend to think we might be talking about something a little bit different, but I don't really know why I think that. Back to that slide, right? I don't know if I have a comprehensive answer. A third possibility when we're talking about evil, are we talking about anthropology? In other words, are we talking about what does it mean to be human? Are we saying human beings are inherently evil? Is that what the question is about? Are we assigning blame, so to speak? I'll say this, I don't think the Bible answers this question quite clearly. There are times, and we'll look at a passage later, that does assign responsibility to evil to human beings, but that's not the same thing as saying that humans are born inherently sinful. You might have heard the expression original sin, which gets tossed around a lot, which was a doctrine that has its roots mostly in St. Augustine, who's writing late 4th, early 5th century. who's spending a lot of time with the Apostle Paul. And Augustine kind of lays the foundation for this understanding that sinfulness is something that gets inherited from your parents, almost biologically. With that comes all sorts of stigmatization around sex and things like that in the Western Church for a very long time. Connected to that become notions of the sinlessness of Mary as well, the belief that, well, then Mary would have to be sinless in order for Jesus to be born without. I mean, you get, it turns into a whole large kind of structure of what's what I want? Well, of doctrine, I guess. I'm not sure it's helpful to talk in that regard, and to show you why I think that, I'm going to show a couple of slides of confessions. If you've been coming, I think Margaret 2 weeks ago talked about some slides from the Book of Confessions. Presbyterians, at least the PCUSA, the branch of Presbyterians that we belong to at Westminster, have collected a variety of confessions, these documents that say this is what we believe, throughout the centuries. And some of them reflect, they don't use that language, original sin, but they reflect that kind of thinking. This is the Second Helvetic Confession, comes from Switzerland. Helvetic means Swiss, from the 16th century. And one line in here, one paragraph in here says, "By sin we understand that innate corruption of man," read that as humanity, "which has been derived or propagated in us all from our first parents, Adam and Eve," right? There's this understanding that somehow something literally has been passed down throughout the human family. By we understand that innate corruption, all are inclined, I messed up the whole sentence. By which we, immersed in perverse desires and averse to all good, are inclined to all evil. Full of all wickedness, distrust, contempt, and hatred of God, we are unable to do or even to think anything good of ourselves. Wow, right? I mean, this is, you might have heard the expression total depravity. There are times where Calvin's theology is described as teaching a kind of total depravity, which isn't just you're sinful, you occasionally do bad things. It means there is nothing good in you whatsoever at all. It's like this worm theology. You are just a worm. God just wants to step on you and grind you under God's heel, but fortunately, God is merciful. And it's this kind of, there is nothing good. But notice this too, unable to do or even to think anything good by ourselves, right? What does that mean then when you start to extend that? Let's keep going. Moreover, even as we grow older, so by wicked thoughts, words, and deeds committed against God's law, we bring forth corrupt fruit worthy of an evil tree. For this reason, by our own deserts, being subject to the wrath of God, we are liable to just punishment. If you read on in the same confession, it even talks about things like that, that humanity is so fallen, is so broken, that even when it comes to things like the arts or technology, innovation, creativity, and design, that even that is impossible. And it's only because of God's grace that humanity makes any progress whatsoever, right? It basically means you are so corrupt and so fallen, you don't even know how to tie your shoes properly if it weren't for the grace of God who just, gives you that knowledge. It's this thoroughgoing notion of human corruption. My question then is, what's the value of something like that? And what's the danger of something like that? Obviously, that way of thinking is trying to say we need to take sin and evil really seriously. The danger here is that the church is preaching there's nothing good at all within you, right? In fact, anytime you think you've done something good, you're just being proud. Kind of cuts off a bit of incentive. Maybe doesn't do so much for things like your own sense of self-worth. We can go on and talk about like that. Maybe you've heard sermons like this in some churches, hopefully not from me or from Margaret, or the other staff. Anyway, the Westminster Confessor. What's that? Oh, yeah, well, Westminster Confession of Faith. You think, well, after 100 years, they surely fixed this. Our first parents being seduced by the subtlety and temptation of Satan. That's interesting, right? Satan gets now personified in the Genesis 3 story. They sinned in eating the forbidden fruit. This, their sin, God was pleased, according to God's wide and holy counsel, to permit, right? God let this happen. That's interesting. Having proposed in order to it, good grief, I would have gotten thrown out of the Westminster. God having proposed to order it to his own glory. In other words, Is God responsible for sin? Not really, but God permitted it because God knew in the end it would glorify God. What kind of God are we talking about here if that's the case, right? Again, spin out the implications of this. The Westminster, the divines, the theologians were probably saying, well, we can't have a universe where God's not in control, but we sure can't have a universe where God's responsible for sin. But how about this? Perhaps this is what glorifies God. I'm not trying to make fun of these people. This was some really good theological thinking of its day when you think as well of what they were fighting against in terms of some other groups. However, I think the consequences of this theology have perhaps been damaging in ways that might have not have been intended, or maybe they were intended. By this sin, they fell from their original righteousness and communion with God, and so became dead in sin and wholly defiled in all the faculties and parts of soul and body. Right? Even human reason is defective because of this, it seems to be suggesting, which could be true. But, again, you can't even tie your shoes without God's help, it seems to suggest. They, being the root of all mankind, the guilt of this sin was imputed, and the same death in sin and corrupted nature conveyed to all their posterity, us, your neighbors, descending, the guy with the leaf blower, descending from them by ordinary generation, from this original corruption, whereby we are utterly indisposed, disabled, and made opposite to all good, and wholly inclined to all evil, do proceed all actual transgressions, right? In other words, you want to know where evil is, it's all deep within you, and that's where the sin comes from, right? Wow, right? Just deep, deep stuff. You're saying they must have fixed this by 1967, right? Little bit. You'll be happy to know the Confession of 1967 doesn't start with sin. It actually starts with Jesus. It actually starts with, in Jesus, we encounter God and we learn something about ourselves. Eventually, it goes on to talk about sin, but it says the reconciling act of God in Jesus Christ exposes the evil in men. We can read that as humanity, as sin in the sight of God. That's interesting, right? You see evil only after you first encounter Christ. It seems to be the suggestion here. In sin, human beings claim mastery of their own lives, turn against God and their fellow humans, and become exploiters and despoilers of the world. Think back to that list we made, right? A lot of that language of exploiting others for one's own gain, despoiling the world. There's an ecological angle in this. They lose their humanity. That's interesting. What a harsh thing to say. In futile striving and are left in rebellion, despair, and isolation. Wise and virtuous people through the ages have sought the highest good in devotion to freedom, justice, peace, truth, and beauty, right? This is saying, well, humanity's actually done some good things over the centuries, right? We've made advances in things like freedom, justice, peace, truth, and beauty. Now it wants to also minimize it. Yet all human virtue, when seen in light of God's love in Jesus Christ, is found to be infected by self-interest and hostility. So it's trying to kind of hold this balance between, right, the good that humanity is able to do, yet somehow in light of Christ, something gets exposed in us, right? Our falling short seems to get exposed. So it's a little bit, of a different way of talking about it. But this notion is everybody born sinful has been, it's in some ways it's deeply embedded in a lot of what we talked about as a Reformed tradition where the Presbyterian Church resides. It's in more recent years, there's been quite a bit of pushback against that. You can imagine where that's damaging in certain ways. Anybody who has lost a child, and you think about this kind of language, what does it mean to lose a child who hasn't been baptized, for example, and what that might mean if the church is going to be consistent in this kind of all people are evil? What are some of the pastoral issues that arise then? What does this mean for how we talk about our neighbors who might not be church members, not be religious at all, right? How do we talk about human responsibility for evil without this becoming something so corrupting that it appears to, I don't know, verter on the point of utter cynicism about humanity and our capacity for good without ignoring our capacity for evil? Kind of a side note there, right? I just wanted to highlight that anthropological question. Sometimes when we talk about evil, we're asking a question about God's trustworthiness, right? Can we trust this God? God finds all the prayers of mankind in his spam folder, is what the cartoon says there, right? Is God lazy? Is God asleep at the switch? Is God responsible for evil? Is God powerless to stop evil? These are age-old questions, right? There are some scriptural passages that raise the question, and surprisingly enough, there's never a satisfactory answer, right? This is one of these mysteries. If there is a good and loving God, why does evil exist? Philosophers spend time with this. Theologians spend time with this. I think the Bible does deny that God is responsible for sin or that God is the source of sin. I also think the Bible finally does not answer this question. Right? Finally doesn't answer the question about, is God powerless to stop it? Where is God when bad things happen to good people? A fifth possibility is that we're asking questions about cosmology. What's out there in the cosmos, right? Who or what is out there? Who or what is to blame? Is there a devil? Are there demons? If so, what's their responsibility? What's their impact? Right? It's those kinds of questions. In some ways, all five of these kind of fit in this category. And when we're talking about what is our role, right? The question isn't, do you understand evil? Thank God. The question is, do you renounce evil and its power in the world? What does that look like to talk about the power of evil? Let me just pause there. There might be some questions or some comments. We've done a lot of kind of heady stuff here, and I've tried to just lay out some possibilities or some ways of thinking about this. Keep going, or are we ready to?
A little concerned by the term natural evil. I'm not entirely sure I agree there is such a thing, but I think that it depends on an object of the evil, and that object either has to be a person or some sort of sentient being, I would think. You go back to the old thing, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, does it make any noise? The other question I would say in response to this, if a tree falls in the forest and kills somebody, is that evil? Is it all of a sudden evil as opposed to just being a tree falling in the forest?
Yeah.
And likewise, hurricanes, striking in open ocean where it doesn't hurt anybody, is that an evil? I can't call falling trees or hurricanes evils.
Right.
Or even forest fires.
Yeah, I follow your point. That's a good point. Right. Don't blame the tiger for being hungry. If you're out walking on the savannah. I'm assuming tigers live in savannas. I don't know. Right. A hurricane doesn't have a moral will. It doesn't choose which path to take. Right. So that's a good point. Right. There is something about the universe or about weather and about the world in which we live that is inherently, can I say, unstable, unpredictable, dangerous, which isn't necessarily the fault of a person. We're on the same page there? Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah, Carl. No.
Well, I guess the first thing that came to me was Jesus' 40 days in the desert.
Yeah.
And it just made me think about, well, it was out there with Jesus. And so I guess in that context, I'm trying to figure this out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in some ways that we could say that might be a cosmological. That's a question of, does Jesus encounter the devil? If so, then what or who is the devil? What was that experience like? Right, we get very few verses to describe some 40-day period. That's interesting too, right? What's the purpose of that? What goes on out there other than the questions that we hear? Yeah, Brent's coming around. Thanks, Brent.
One of the things that I was thinking about with the concept of evil is that we oftentimes use that to distance ourselves from the capacity of doing whatever it is that we're talking about as evil.
Yeah.
And one of the most troubling things I think about the political discourse that is occurring in the country right now is the tendency for people to identify the opposing people as evil,
Right.
people in the opposition as evil.
Right.
And I wonder if you might comment about that.
Just to say, I agree that this is where this is one of the reasons why I try to not over-define evil for myself, because I'm worried about the tendency of too quickly assigning that to others. Like we need a moratorium in this country on calling people Hitler, like modern day Hitlers, for example, in the political discourse, right? Because that seems to be the end, right? I guess we'd start calling people the devil, but it's right. There's a way in which that cuts off any further conversation, is what I think, which is what kind of worries me about that from time to time. with all five of these too, I would say a good question to ask is, as you think about, do we need to answer these questions? How do I answer these questions? What questions do I want to leave unanswered? Is to remember what's maybe helpful about pursuing each question, but also who gets harmed, right? Who gets hurt with some of these, um, ways of thinking. Especially if we're too quick to judge certain things. I'll say more about that in just a moment, but.
I'm wondering about if there's something missing here, a question about eschatology, which is here, who or what is to blame? Is God powerless? It seems as if things are going to be put right and people are going to be held accountable, and the evil in the world will be shown to be truly evil, besides just the murder of Jesus on the cross. So I agree with you, and there's a lot of mystery involved here, and it's hard to nail down some of these categories just in a rational way. But the whole picture here that's painted seems to bring an end to it.
Yeah. So folks know that term eschatology, we're talking about future things, right? Where is this all headed? Where's the story going? How will God bring things to a meaningful, satisfying end or consummation? And so kind of judgment fits into that. What does it mean to experience judgment? Will God reveal evil and those types of things? Will God win at some final battle over evil? It's language we see a lot in the book of Revelation, for example. So I think along with the idea of reward and punishment, from what you're talking about, is the idea of truth-telling, right? Things finally being shown to be what they truly are. Some of that also is knowledge, right? Ways in which you might see, oh, perhaps what I thought was horrendous actually turned out to have good dimensions of it. I think of the story of Joseph and his brothers there, the ones who sell him into slavery, and then when they come and apologize after he saved their lives, he says, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. Now, I'm wary of that theology if it has everything will turn out fine in the end kind of thing to it. But it is a kind of theology that says, let's see where God might yet take things, right? And what does it mean to trust in God despite the suffering I endure, things like that. I don't know if that's similar to what you were talking about as well. Let's do one more, and then I need to move on to more slides.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, going back to the Wesleyan quadrilateral and reason and what we know about human biology, especially neuroscience, how might how might knowledge of those aspects of human beings inform our discussion of evil?
Yeah, I would love that, right? This would be much more interesting if we had a neuroscientist or a psychologist up here instead of me. I'd find it more interesting. I think you're right in some ways. You know, my father was epileptic and would have seizures if he didn't take his Dilantin, or if he drank too much, or if he didn't sleep too much. And in some faith communities, he would have been labeled possessed, right? Demonically possessed, for example. So, and every now and then somehow I catch stories like these. There's stories about communities where they try to drive a spirit out of a child or sometimes an adult who might be epileptic or might have some kind of a, forgive me, getting the terms exactly right, but some kind of psychological disorder. And end up killing the kid or doing irreparable harm as well. So I worry about being too quick to assign a kind of spiritual stain or a kind of spiritual infection on people when there might be some scientific answers, and I'm not saying the scientific answers make a lot of sense either, right? Why was my father epileptic and your father was not, or something like that, right? Why does Dilantin work and other medications do not? Those types of questions, right? But I know it worked, and I know it's, I mean, and so some of it has to do, I think, with what we can control and what things are out of our control, and how the things that are out of our control sometimes scare us, and sometimes we're quick to label them evil. It's not to get too pious about it. It's what they do to Jesus. When the scribes come and investigate Jesus in the Gospels, they say he's under the power of Beelzebul. They say he's satanic. That's why he can do all these amazing things. right? And I think that's partly a statement of fear on their part. So, all right. Big questions, right? We're just going to raise even more and more questions, I'm afraid. When it comes to the Bible, then, how does the Bible, I notice I didn't say what kinds of questions can the Bible answer, but what kind of a discussion can the Bible convene? How can the Bible call us into thinking more about some of these things? I will say this. The first thing we want to note is the Bible gives a variety of perspectives about evil. Last week, the message was the Bible gives a variety of perspectives about sin. Here we go. The Bible gives a variety of perspectives about evil. If you were to read the entire Old Testament start to finish and remember everything you read, and then start reading the New Testament, you'd be pretty confused once you got a few chapters into the New Testament, because all of a sudden the New Testament starts talking about things like a Messiah, starts talking about things like resurrection, and talks about Satan or a devil, talks about demons and demon-possessed people, which are almost entirely absent from the Old Testament. Remember, there's several centuries separating those testaments, but also the Old Testament itself represents a variety of centuries. And part of what's going on there is there's development, right? Religions change over time. They come into contact with other cultures, other religions, and they have to explain things like, where does evil come from, right? What is your God like? Is your God trustworthy or not? Just by way of example, the Old Testament refers to Satan only in 3 places. And that name, it's actually, the Hebrew word is Satan. Ha-Satan means the adversary. That word Satan got carried into English, right, as Satan, just like previously got carried into Greek and other languages just by taking the Hebrew word. Most notably is in the first 2 chapters of Job. And I don't know if you've read the book of Job, it happens in the book of Job. Job is this saintly man. God is very proud of Job. God says, have everybody seen Job? There is nobody like him on earth, right? He is so pious. And God is surrounded, it appears, by a kind of heavenly host, right? By other beings, other non-human, supernatural beings, whether angels or what, but some kind of divine counsel. And God is boasting about Job there. And this one other being, the Satan, right, the adversary, the accuser, says, I'll bet if you messed up Job's life, he would curse you. I get it's, yeah, Job's pious, but it's only because Job's got such a cush life. And so in what makes the book of Job a little bit scary, it looks like this whole thing where Job is being used as a test, right, as this kind of object lesson is one of the terrifying things of it. That's the Satan, right? It's this, it appears to be this angelic being whose function is to accuse or to kind of be the prosecuting attorney in front of God, the judge. In the book of Zechariah and also in the book of First Chronicles, there's a brief mention to the Satan who's just kind of up to mischief. In Zechariah, it's he denounces a chief priest. And in First Chronicles, he compels David to take a census of the people against God's desires, right? Because why do kings take censuses? Taxation purposes, right? And to find young men they can send off to war, those types of things, or why censuses are criticized in that part of the Old Testament. When you get to the New Testament, Satan is a fully formed, he's an adversary of God. He's the source of wickedness, source of evil. Carl, you mentioned the temptation in the wilderness, right? He does battle with Jesus, or he tries to divert Jesus from the way that Jesus is on. There's talk about demons that appear to be in league in some way with Satan. Part of this comes into Judaism in that time between the Testaments. And we could talk a lot about that, but I just want to say for the most part, in the Old Testament, there's no real sense of a dualism, of a good God versus an evil being who's responsible for things. In the New Testament, that sense is much more present, right? Of God, the source of good, the God who sends Jesus Christ, and this Satan, this devil, this evil one who's up to no good. So there is a dualism there in the New Testament of kind of good and evil. One thing that's important to notice, the New Testament never suggests that these are co-equal powers, right? Always talks about God's superiority over Satan, talks about a final victory, to go back to the eschatology, over evil, over those things. The New Testament also ascribes evil to human beings, right? Not in a fully consistent way, but in places, says that you want to know where evil comes from, It comes from humanity. And one place to look at this, I'll go kind of quickly here. The context is some Jewish religious leaders named Pharisees are criticizing Jesus because his disciples aren't washing their hands according to the tradition. Nowhere in the Old Testament does it say ordinary people have to wash their hands before eating, but nevertheless, it became a tradition in a lot of Jewish communities by the time Jesus comes around, and his disciples apparently are not washing their hands before they eat. Either they're flouting the tradition or they're just slobs. It's not exactly clear why, but they complain to Jesus, and Jesus complains back to them and says, you don't understand the law. You're not even following the law the way you should. Then Jesus calls the crowd to him and said, listen and understand. It's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person. So we're talking about dietary laws here and cleanliness, but it's what comes out of the mouth that defiles. Then the disciples approached him and said, you know that the Pharisees took offense when they heard what you said? He answered, every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind. And if one blind person guides another, both will fall into a pit. In other words, I don't care that I've offended the Pharisees. Let's keep moving. But Peter said, explain this parable to us, or rather explain this aphorism to us about it's not what goes into the mouth that defiles, but it's what comes out of the mouth that defiles. Then Jesus said, are you also still without understanding? This is the Gospels. They never seem to get it. And he's like, really? Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach and goes out into the sewer? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this is what defiles. For out of the heart come evil intentions, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile. In some ways, he blows up the system of defilement here, right? He says it's not about the things you do to the external parts of your body. It's not even about what you eat, right? And this is where Christians kind of trace the end of dietary laws that we read about in the Old Testament. But he says, it doesn't mean that things are easy now, right? He says the source of evil, the source of it is actually in the human heart. Now, in the ancient world, the heart wasn't so much the seat of emotions or love as it tends to be in our culture. It's the seat of the will, right? It's where you make decisions about what to do is in the heart. So interesting, right? He says that the root of evil or the location of evil is actually the human heart. A little bit closer to home, right? In doing this. This is going to matter then for how we talk about what is salvation. What does that look like, right? If indeed Jesus is saying that the problem is you, people, you can see where that doctrine of being utterly sinful comes from in some ways, right? Kind of let's take this and roll it down the hill a little ways and see what it accumulates. So this is something that Jesus says as well about our own inclination. In other words, the New Testament doesn't say blame it all on spiritual powers, right? Also says there's an aspect of human responsibility that's there. In fact, most of the time it blames wrongdoing on human responsibility. Not to say that we're all necessarily evil to the core, right? But just says most human beings don't need a lot of work to devise evil, right? Or to do evil. Some things to say, and then we'll have some conversation, right? I think when we're talking about evil, we talked about the language of mystery that surrounds this idea of evil. One of the ways the Bible tries to get at that is through this theme of conflict, right? There's a theme of conflict that's woven through, especially early Christian understanding. Not good versus evil, who's going to win, right? But the idea of the ways of God being thwarted by either human failings that we might call evil, or powers in the universe or powers in our society that somehow thwart God's good work. And kind of baked into Christianity is an expectation that God isn't done yet, right? That we're still awaiting the fullness of what Jesus promised, right? In other words, if this is the best of all possible worlds, we're in big trouble, right? That we're still expecting more from God. If you don't believe me, come back during Advent, right? That's how we start the Christian year every year. So how do we talk about that? That's theme of conflict and struggle. How do we acknowledge that without it turning into we're right, we're blessed, everybody else is evil, everybody else is accursed, which I think everybody recognizes is not a helpful way to go. Something about evil defies explanation. You've made that really clear over the last 45 minutes, Matt. Thanks. Is evil more than the sum of its parts? In other words, is evil more than just the collection of all of the bad things I do or the good things I was supposed to do? Is there also something about the human condition that just defies all of our attempts to fix it, right? Or that, like I said, somehow just leans toward atrocity, and sometimes in ways that we just can't even fully understand until we're later down the road. And again, how do we carry this? How do we carry this in our own bodies? How do we carry this in our own families? How do we carry this in our societies? How is some of this woven into bad decisions people make that also gets carried in our bodies, right? People pollute, for example, that causes illness that get carried, can be passed along through communities, right? This interesting kind of holistic interaction between the world in which we live and the suffering that people endure for all sorts of reasons. What capacity for doing evil or for encouraging evil do we all carry? And what do we do with that? How do we speak about that? Does this mean everybody's a horrible person and there's nothing you can do without God's saving grace in your life? It might be taking it a little bit too far. That's bad news for maybe for the Muslims down the street from me, from some theological reckoning. I mean, how do we think about the human capacity for evil, but also the human capacity for good? These are questions I have, concluding thoughts, concluding questions, concluding wonderings, right? If anything, I hope what today is an encouragement to think about evil as something that our theology helps equip us to name, to avoid, to denounce, while at the same time not being too quick to believe that we understand exactly all of the contours of evil and who's evil and who's not. So I have two questions then. Oh, we've got 3 minutes. That's helpful. Sorry about that. Maybe take these with you to go. Maybe these are great for the drive home, or or if Tim's sermon starts to meander, you can take care of I don't know what he's preaching on. What's a claim about evil that you think is important to make, right? What can we say about evil? For me, I would say I think evil exists. I think evil is a real thing that's, again, more than just my stupidity or my ignorance, that there's something about when you get human beings together, we have a capacity to do some really dumb things sometimes, and to out of our fear or out of our self-preservation to do some things. Second, what is a question about evil that you think is best left unresolved? To avoid some mistakes. I get to teach the Gospels at Luther Seminary, and that's always fun, especially because we have students who come from all over the place. And when you teach the Gospel of Mark, in chapter 1, there's an exorcism. And it's always great because somebody will say, well, clearly this person was suffering from a mental illness. And then there's somebody, and it's often an international student, who will say, oh no, I've been to plenty of exorcisms and I'll tell you all about them right now. And then, all the suburban white students are just shell shocked, right, by some of these stories. And, then I have to remind people there's churches doing exorcisms, probably a mile from where we're sitting right now. What do we make of that? What do we do with that? I tend to be rather, I'm happy leaving a lot of questions like that unresolved. And my international students aren't stupid. They're not superstitious. They're not yokels. They've got ways of seeing the world, and they've got experiences in their lives. So I'm more than happy. I raised that. I bring up that story because we're out of time, but also because I want to. I just want to say I'm open for conversation about this because I have no idea what the source of evil is in the world. I just know that there is some. And the good news is the next 2 weeks we'll talk about what does God do about that. So be in conversation. I know it gives you the willies to talk about these things, and we're not supposed to do that at a place like Westminster. But we talk about the beauty and the good. And so any final thoughts? Anyone want the last word? This is really I had no idea how to end this. You've probably realized that too by now. Deliver us from evil. Exactly. That's the prayer, right? And in some settings, it's deliver us from the evil one. Like we can't even agree what that actually, but deliver us from evil is a really good prayer. I tend to think poking around in evil is a bad idea, but resting in the promises of God or not. Brent, looks like you want to say something. You got the microphone and you're standing up.
What I've been thinking of is what I like about the second question is Nietzsche said the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. And
Yeah, I think I believe that.
it's interesting because one thing left unresolved is who are the evil people? Because in the wrong situation, it could be any one of us.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I believe that. It's not pleasant to think about and to talk about, but I think that's true. Which is way better than, I don't want to blame things on some guy with horns hiding in the closet. It becomes too easy for to escape my own culpability then. Supposed to remind you there's a lovely prelude that starts early this morning. So if you're into, is it Bach? Okay, it's Bach. So you might want to run over to the service. If not, we can talk about evil a little bit more here. So thank you for your time. Next week, Margaret will talk about what does it mean to speak of Jesus as Lord. Not controversial at all.